This year, 2022, it's in fact two memorial years. One is that in 2002 this building was inaugurated, but the other, which is maybe less known, is that in 1942 America recognized Austrian refugees as Austrians, and those who had to escape the Nazi regime and found shelter here in America, many of them in culture, in arts, found here a new place where to work and contributed to the American arts, to the American society, such as Lisette Model. I will be brief. I'm very humbled that we managed to get this collection by Dr. Jedlicka here to New York, thanks to Gerald. Gerald, you contributed to a miracle. Thank you so much. And it's also a great honor to have you here. Welcome, Mike Kimmelmann, and the
pleasure.
Okay,
thank you. Thanks, of course. So I'm going to just say a few words briefly, and if it's okay, I'll say them partly about Gerald, because it relates to the work, I think. So Gerald and I met in the mid-1990s when there was a project to build a memorial at the Judenplatz in Vienna, and Gerald, I believe, was on the committee or the jury involved with this, and I got to know him. And what I remember at that time was that Gerald was somebody who was also very much engaged with the history of the city and with its history of culture, and with this idea, really, of remembering these figures who had been who had to leave and had been written out of history. And I think that memorial was and remains really quite an extraordinary place in Vienna. And I mention that because the other thing that Gerald did, which was crucial, of course, was his work at the Kunsthalle. And in the years that I went back to Vienna, the Kunsthalle, especially at the Karlsplatz, became a kind of extraordinary laboratory for civic development. It was a place of contemporary art, but it was also a gathering place in the city. And it was a place that re-energized a part of the city. But it was also a place that I think was incredibly cosmopolitan. You know, the notion of cosmopolitanism goes back to Diogenes. You know, it's this whole idea of bringing together all sorts of different people in one place, and it is a sort of, it's rooted in a notion of democracy. And the Karlsplatz always struck me as being incredibly interesting because the programs that Gerald did were very international in focus. They opened Vienna up, and they also created a place that was very, very open. So among the programs that he did was the first retrospective, I suppose, of Lisette Model, which was part of a series of projects to recuperate exiled or forgotten Austrians, including architects like Neutra and Schindler. Really quite an extraordinary thing. So this exhibition is about Model coming here as well and influencing Diane Arbus, and Arbus in turn influencing Golden, and so seeing this transcontinental, very much international vocabulary. The photographs that Model took, of course, we were talking a little earlier, they're a little like Sander, but they're also really rooted in the city and in places. Were translated through Arbus into also, I think, celebrations of a kind of cosmopolitanism. And this is what, of course, Golden represented and still does, right? A moment in the city and in the life of the city, the kind of vitality of the city that is sort of as much the subject, I think, as the people in her photographs. I just wanted to tell you one quote I found from Arbus, which speaks to this, and then I'll turn this over to Joe. She said, "The world is a Noah's Ark on the sea of eternity, containing all the endless pairs of things, irreconcilable and inseparable, And heat will always long for cold, and the back for the front, and smiles for tears, and mutt for Jeff, and no for yes, with the most unutterable nostalgia there is. The last thing I'll say is, I think in Orbis's work, there actually is a deep humanity. I think she had a great human sympathy. There's often a focus on the sensational aspects of her pictures, but I think there really is in her work this understanding and embrace of the diversity of humanity and its complexity. And that seems to me the real theme of this show, and I also think it reminds me of the work that Gerald has done. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. So, yeah, it's an honor and pleasure for me being able to present this exhibition here, which bridges Austrian and American culture, and to present it in the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York. And thank you, Michael, for your passion and support for this project. And last but not least, I want to thank you, Michael, who is an old and wonderful friend, for your warm and flattering words. Thanks. Thanks also to the collector Dani Lenska, and thanks to the team here, which did a very professional work and which made this exhibition in the way you can see it possible. Some might ask, how did I come up with the idea to confront the work of these three artists and generations with each other? For me, this is an important show as it mirrors, and Michael spoke about this, not only what photography means to me, but also reflects important shows I could do in Vienna. They were mentioned already. Maybe I want to add one of these shows, which was Nan Goldin's I Will Be Your Mirror, which we produced together with the Guggenheim Museum at that time. Recently I was rereading Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, and I came across one of his thoughtful and provocative quotes. He says, "It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible." When you look at the works of Modell, Arbus and Godin here, this sentence of Oscar Wilde finds its confirmation and equivalent in their attitudes and photographs. When Lisette Modell said, "It's the surface I'm interested in because the surface is the inside." When Diane Arbus confirms, "I really believe there are things nobody would see if I didn't photograph them." And when Nan Goldin adds, "I think that you can actually give people access to their own soul," you understand that the work of these three extraordinary artists is also mainly about giving visibility to life. That's why photography for me is probably one of the most effective and forceful medias, as it opens our eye for things we looked at but didn't see. It makes the supposedly visible only visible. Extraordinary pictures like the ones of Modell, Arbus and Goldin are not only an expression of their time, they have also something ongoing, a kind of super-temporal life that invites us again and again to new reflections and interpretations. For me, good photography has a lot to do with good stories. A good photo makes me pause my gaze and invites my imagination to continue telling a story. What extraordinary photography, like the works of Lisette Modell, Diane Arbus and Nan Goldin, makes so magic, it's also its power of attraction and not being able to look away anymore. A good photograph is for me to embark on a journey in my mind. I invite you to join me on that journey here in this show. So the magnificent snapshots of Lisette Modell take us to the clubs and streets of the 1940s and 50s in New York, to the overcrowded beaches of Coney Island, to the street canyons of a vibrating melting pot, onto the shores of the Côte d'Azur, during the last years of democratic Europe that had grown tired in the face of the fascist storm. Correspondingly, the accurate yet so sensitive eye of Diane Arbus makes us forget the cliches of the glamorous images of a booming, idolized post-war America, showing us its abysses, outsiders and lost, and this with great humanity. The photographs of Nan Goldin bring back memories of the wild and exciting life of subculture scene of the New York of the 80s and 90s, with all its hopes and fears, joys and sorrows, the spirit of liberation and the tragedy of the HIV epidemic. And the Austrian emigrant Lisette Modell, she was born in Vienna in 1901, named Elise Amélie Felice Stern, was a scholar of Arnold Schoenberg, and we already heard it had to flee 1938 to the United States. She stands for the unbelievable loss of flourishing Austrian Jewish culture caused by the terror of the Nazi regime, a culture which enriched American artistic life, just to mention some of the Austrian artists coming and staying and working in the United States, who shaped the image of the American way of life, like Billy Wilder, Fred Zinnemann, or Erich von Stroheim. There she came into contact, Lisette Model, with influential personalities such as Alexei Brodovich, the art director of Harper's Bazaar, for which she also took on commissions, working with colleagues famous colleagues like Ansel Adams or Bernice Abbott. Model photographed New York, hotels, bars, nightclubs on the Lower East Side, portrayed the urban life of New York. She also produced formalist works like Shop Windows, one we have here, and Walking. In 1952, she began a photo series on jazz and photographed musicians like Louis Armstrong, Frank Sinatra, and Ella Fitzgerald. After she got target of the McCarthy campaign of suspicion and persecution, she lost more and more her commercial jobs and went into teaching. She taught photography at the California School of Fine Arts, and from 1951 until her death in 1983, she taught at the New York School for Social Research in New York City. Model influenced a whole generation of American photographers. Her best-known students were Diane Arbus and Bruce Weber. Others to be mentioned are Larry Fink and Shelley Ruston. Diane Arbus, also having a Jewish immigrant background, was born as Diane Nemiroff in an upper-class New York family. Her father owned a well-known department store at Fifth Avenue. Starting as a successful fashion photographer, working for Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Esquire, and others, she turned in the 50s more and more to a social, photography which was aware of social issues. Her imagery helped to make marginalized groups visible and highlighted the importance of proper presentation of all people. She photographed with rare psychological intensity a wide range of subjects, including strippers, carnival performers, nudists, people with dwarfism, children, mothers, couples, elderly people, in unique, sometimes inappropriate situations and positions. Until then, they were never presented before. Her work expanded the notions of the acceptable subject matter and ignored and violated canons of the use distance between photographer and subject. She represented, after her death, America at the Venice Biennale. Her book, Diane Arbus, Aperture Monograph, got one of the most successful books in the history of photo books. Yes, and then Goldin was born in Washington, grew up in a middle-class Jewish family, and her work explored, you already heard it, the New York underground scene, the LGBT community of the 80s and 90s, and the HIV crisis. As she was part of the scene, part of one family, as she said, her work is authentic, full of empathy and moments of intimacy. Her masterwork, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, of which you can see some of the photographs here in that show, documents the post-Stonewall gay subculture and Goldin's family and friends. She lives in New York, Berlin, and Paris. The three iconic women photographers recorded the social life of America during different phases of the 20th century. The show The Camera's Crew, by the way, there's a quote by Diane Arbus, presents representatives of three generations. Their work is the expression of their time and milieus, but also an homage to the diversity and different existences, and repeatedly questions the validity of norms and conventions. What they share is their interest in the social dimensions of coexistence, in those living on the margins of society, and extraordinary personalities and the eccentric. Model, Arbus, and Goldin also radically redefined the dialogue between photographer and subject in a new way, combining a documentary approach with personal subjectivity. It reflects the position of the three of them when Lisette Model demanded, in a very programmatic and self-assured manner, never photograph anything you are not personally interested in. I wish you an interesting time with that show, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, Mike. Now please enjoy the show and enjoy a glass of Austrian wine.